Welcome, SuperMOOCers. Welcome to our academic interview for the Environment module. With us today is Dr. Doug Seefelt, and he's going to explain to us a little bit about the environment and what he does, and we're going to learn all sorts of awesome things. So here we go. So tell us a little bit about yourself and your area of specialty.
Sure. I was trained in Western history, American West, and my second field was North American environmental history. So they often go together. We think of the West as these wide open spaces and some dramatic landscapes worth preserving and things like that. So I was able to satisfy both of my research interests, the human sort of interaction with the environment and the particular Western American history.
And what drew you to the environment?
I don't know. I was born in Illinois, and I moved. My family moved to Colorado when I was in third grade. So I think that has something to do with it. I remember just how dramatic the change was, and looking out every day to see the Front Range of the Rocky Mountains as opposed to Peoria, Illinois. So I think there's something there. We did outdoor things, whether it was the typical Boy Scout type stuff or other friends going skiing or camping, hiking. And then I've been around. I went to school in Massachusetts, in Western Massachusetts, which is a real beautiful part of New England. Got to go up into Vermont, New Hampshire, Maine, Maritimes up there, Newfoundland for a semester. Wow. Then I did my master's at the University of Oregon in Eugene, and that's where I really first formally studied environmental history, and I was able to be a graduate assistant in my advisor's course and do some discussion sections there, right? And Oregon's pretty green. It was in the 90s when I was there. And then I did my PhD at Arizona State in Tempe, in the middle of the desert, really. And I studied with Stephen Pine, who is probably the world's foremost historian of fire. So thinking about humans' relationship to the earth through fire over deep time really opened up my mind to these larger questions, that kind of are much more significant than local politics or some of the things we tend to obsess about.
That's awesome. And I have to tell everybody that our own Allie Cavanis, Scandal Savage, is his research assistant.
Yes, Allie's been helping me this last year on some of the digital history things I've been working on at Ball State.
So, yay. So what do people now, what are the big topics in studying the environment?
Yeah, it has its own history. Environmental history, you can kind of see its origins coming out of certainly the conservation movement of the late 19th, early 20th century, but really taking off in what we would call sort of the environmental movement of the post-World War II years. I think the first environmental history class, if I'm not mistaken, was offered by Roderick Nash at one of the UC schools in 1970, I think it was. Okay. So, if you wanted to study it, you really were going to study the more scientific angles on it until Nash's first class. He also wrote a book on nature and the American mind, which really looked at the history of American attitudes toward nature from the European colonists up to the present. He's writing in this late 60s, early 70s. There was a lot going on at that time, as you know, in American politics, with a bunch of laws and new agencies, and we think of those sorts of things. But it's hard to put a bow around it in a sense, because it's a interdisciplinary endeavor. So you're working maybe with everybody from art historians to more folks that study, like I say, wildfire or river systems or things like that. And so you're constantly learning other disciplines, methods, jargon, and trying to then bring in what helps you tell these stories. I think it's it's in a nutshell, though, we're all trying to examine the very complex and oftentimes different relationships that humans have had with the world around them at particular points in time. So there's a lot of moving parts in there, depending on what you're looking at. So there's been a real focus in the last couple decades to very biospecific histories, whether it's going to be what they call like bioregions, or things that can be, rather than political boundaries like states or countries, more sort of drawing the lines where you might have a watershed, or you might have some other kind of bio differentiator. So that's changed a lot of the story, to be able to tell the complex local stories of different ecosystems and the people who've come into relationship with it, and whether they've improved it, which is rare, or modified it in ways that maybe have compromised its status and things like that. So there's a lot of so if you look at the bookshelf of an environmental historian, you would see not just books on Americans and their forests, but you would see books about particular forests and particular, let's say, agricultural activities or irrigation on certain regions of the earth, as opposed to these broad sweeping things.
That's really interesting, because I have an anthropology and archaeology background, and we always studied groups as those regions, as mostly along rivers, because that's, was important. So that's interesting that's gone that direction also. So why do you think people should study the environment?
Well, to know the world around us. I mean, I'm a humanist, right? I'm not from the hard sciences or anything like that. So I'm always trying to understand better what has held meaning, how people have created meaning out of the world that they've developed, and you can't tell those stories without a real active causal understanding of how they've worked together. The environment's not the backdrop, it's not a static thing that sits there while humans act out their play. So you have to really work on identifying those causal relationships that have affected the environment. And so I think anybody who is interested in being self-aware and drawing great satisfaction from understanding their place in the world and where it has been, where it may go, you have to deal with the environment. I mean, nowadays it's almost a cliche, but in the academy, certainly you can't get very far down the road of people taking your work seriously if you're not including somehow, we talk about race, class, gender, and environment. I mean, it's joined the big three, if you will, in how do you tell that story, even if like I'm going to write the history of Muncie, let's say, how would you do that without those things?
Yeah. Oh, that's my text. Sorry. We'll just go on. And I agree. You have to have the context around to understand the story. Yeah. So, do you think stories about the environment and popular culture help or hurt people's ideas about the environment?
Well, it depends on what they are, because there can be a lot of that complexity sort of washed over or lost in the generalizations that might make their way into popular culture. Whether it's something like, those tree-hugging environmentalists on one hand, or the anti-environment developers on the other, and there's certainly a lot of gray in between these areas that can get lost in it just tends to be the more popular things are, the rounder the edges, So, but on the other hand, the impact that it can have to get a message across is undeniable and certainly very beneficial if it leads people to ask questions and follow up with learning more, like in this course here, or in their daily lives. They read something in the newspaper, maybe they want to go check it out. Nowadays, you don't have to go to the research library or the public library. You can go online, let your fingers do the walking, and you can learn a little bit about climate change or wildfire policy, or what are we doing with mercury poisoning with fish, and all these kinds of things that people otherwise would have had a hard time getting access to. This stuff is now much more available. But when you think about the real shifts, the real ways that environmental awareness has been developed in this country, it almost always revolves around some public discussion, some public attitude, first awareness and then change. When you think back to the conservation era, we think about Teddy Roosevelt and Gifford Pinchot and John Muir, and they're all talking about fighting over whether there should be a dam put in a national park, right, at Yosemite, the Hetch Hetchy. Well, San Francisco had an earthquake. They need this stable water supply. Arguments all up and down for that. You've got this thing that was set aside first as a state park and then a national park. How could you develop in it, And so you had these two sides, and people wrote letters, and people read about these things in the newspaper, and ultimately, as they say, while they lost the battle over Hetch Hetchy, the dam was built, the reservoir is there. They won the war in the sense they raised awareness about the consequences, and are we a nation that wants to preserve certain landscapes like national parks from development like dams or not? And so that led to much more, I wouldn't say activism, but much more awareness. And then when you get to the post-war period and you start to think of that era of big dams, the Hoover Dam was built in the New Deal in the 30s, and then up in the Northwest, you think of Grand Coulee and all these other places that were made for the war effort to make aluminum and all these things. Then people started to, have those attitudes. Another generation grew up with those attitudes and were able to then become more active to stop development on the Colorado River, for example, and stop dams and make the government, who's building the dams, pause. And that from those, like the Glen Canyon dam controversy, came this real environmental awareness where people were saying we're starting to equate the environment with some sacred kind of almost quasi-religious sensibilities, and you wouldn't flood the Sistine Chapel. Why would you flood the Grand Canyon by building a dam on the Colorado River? So people who couldn't understand irrigation or flood control or engineering of dams could understand those ideas, those bigger ideas. And so the environmental movement kind of ran with that. And you see a lot of fiction. You think of Edward Abbey and the Monkey Wrench Gang, a popular book. You think of some of the attitudes that will show up in films and other sorts of fiction and stuff like that. And so when people are then exposed to that, through those channels, that leads them to other exploring. So I think, again, of like when you think of Rachel Carson and Silent Spring, okay, this is in the 60s. This became a bestseller. I mean, this book about DDT and its effects on birds, really, became an analogy for, what are we doing to our environment? Are we the next species that's going to, be gone? And that book forced policy change at the highest level, at the President of the United States. So things like that can really have an impact.
Okay. So why do you think that there's people have a debate going on about global warming?
Well,
it seems like all the science is there, but people are still fighting against it. So why do you think that is?
Well, it's kind of the way things go in many ways. As I said, these stories are by nature complex, and so the capacity and interest for some people to wade into that complexity can be rather just limited with their daily lives and other things they have to do. And the it goes for the media as well. There are some media outlets that want to delve into that and really get into the ins and outs and share that with their interested constituents. But let's just be honest, that's a smaller group of people who are interested in those details at this point. And the other folks are maybe only going to hear it in the grossest, the largest, the most generic form possible, and then filtered through, everything is political and all politics is local and all of that. So you start to see people having different agendas, and the environmental historian Donald Worcester has spent much of his career studying the sort of causal relationship of capitalism as an economic system to American environmental situations. And so whether it's the Dust Bowl, right, we're going to farm, so we're plowing up stuff that maybe shouldn't have been plowed up, and then when these things happen over long periods of time, a drought, and you're going to now all of a sudden have stuff blowing away that wouldn't have blown away before if it hadn't been plowed, that kind of thing. Same thing with the irrigation and the damming, and now you start to think about global warming in this, or climate change, or whatever you want to say, in these contexts. And so I think there's dividing lines of people who are, at the end of it, every human should be concerned about the future of the planet that we exist on, right? But not everyone takes that long view, so they'll take a more shorter view where I'm a lobbyist for this industry, or my livelihood depends on this industry, and we saw this with the spotted owl controversy in the Northwest when George Bush Sr. was president, right? And bumper stickers and all of that, jobs over owls and all these kinds of things. And now today, whether it's the Brazilian rainforest or what have you, people are going to be on different sides of it by whichever part of that complexity touches them most directly.
Yeah, whatever affects their lives.
That whole attitude. So, for when you think about the Kyoto protocol, or whatever it was in 97 or something, the United States didn't sign, right? But we kept going to the meetings, and we have this kind of, we're the only nation that has a certain designation where we're kind of behind it. We're not denying it, but we're not going to abide by it. Canada, I think, said they're not going to do it. And then pretty much the rest of the world, to a varying degree, has signed on to try to, the industrialized parts, to try to limit their greenhouse gases or something like that. So they, in 97, they were saying by 2005 we are going to have a lower, made efforts to lower our emissions of greenhouse gases. So they bought into that as a cause of the climate change. The United States was saying we weren't going to do that. We're going to wait and see. I guess we're still waiting to see. And so a lot of that has to do with economics. It has to do with big issues that impact nations, not just individuals living in little biomes, right?
Yeah. Do you think part of the problem is wording is everything? Words carry different meanings. And do you think that the term global warming is an issue for just the layperson? Because I've heard a lot of people, when they're really cold temperatures, say, ha, global warming can't be true. They don't understand the science behind it. Do you think that's the terms are one of the issues?
Oh, well, no doubt. Whether it's, people's right to choose, or, abortion. We play with the semantics in order to, again, divide. But I brought this on. This is something I picked up at one of the national parks on a trip. And so this is one of their brochures that they have on climate change in the national parks. And so there's probably no place, well, with the exception of maybe Antarctica, but there's probably not very many places on Earth that are more studied than national parks. This is what these people do for a living. They have to ensure, almost by law, right, that they preserve or at least conserve these areas. And so they need to understand how they work. And so they're, here's the Department of the Interior making these available to everyone who comes through, and to better understand climate change and its impact, by focusing on these things that we value. I mean, America takes a lot of exceptionalist sort of pride in the fact we have the world's first national park, right, Yellowstone, and that it helps sort of define us as a nation. So to then, in a pamphlet, just to understand how it's been impacted, these places we take our vacations or want to show our kids, is a way to kind of reach people in a different way. So it is part of their life and not just some abstract idea. But I think there's a lot of education that has to happen, and there's very few places that people are going to get that kind of education. They're not going to get it on cable news, and they're not going to get it, they're not going to have a direct relationship with the sort of gray literature of the scientific reports that are sitting, out of reach. So there needs to be, something like this and other things in people's daily lives that give them an avenue to understand those kinds of things.
Yeah, and that's kind of what this is for, because I come from the academic world where there's not much translation to the public, and I come from the Margaret Mead kind of school of thought, where let's do this for a reason. So, whatever we can do.
Well, and the other thing is that another important environmental historian named William Cronin wrote a real important essay some years ago about how nature is this place for stories, right? And he was really trying to focus on how it matters, what the stories are, and how we tell them. He used, for example, the Dust Bowl, where there's been so much scholarship about it. I mentioned Donald Worcester's book, which was critical of capitalism as the main instigator of this. There are other books that blame the farmers, and other books that just blame nature, like it's a whimsical thing and it just did its thing. And this is all the same phenomenon. It happened in America in the 1930s, but there's three different interpretations that he highlights. There's even more, I'm sure. Using those same sources, they just tell different stories. And so he comes to this conclusion, which I think is really interesting, how we don't, as environmental historians, we can't simply tell stories about nature. We have to often tell stories about nature. So how have we understood nature in the past, and how does that impact the way we see the world? So when you think about that that's where my interests lie, in sort of the cultural intellectual approach to the topic. So the class that I teach now at Ball State on this is kind of a broad survey from the first time North America in the Ice Age, right? And then people coming over, and eventually colonists coming over from Europe, and the native peoples before that. So all these different things, and we come up to the present pretty much, and see how in that broad sweep of time and these ideas, how values about real estate and land, law has impacted the way we value certain places. A lot of these national parks were allowed to be created because they were thought of as worthless, okay, in the sense that they didn't hold great mineral deposits or lots of other resources that we needed as a growing, industrializing country. Some places have been found to have things we now want, and so they've had to try to work, these lobbies and other interests, industrial interests, will try to get them away from the government. And so there's all sorts of interesting things about our attitudes. And then the sort of romantic period, when you think about those great landscape paintings, and how that has influenced people who never set foot in some of these places. They live in these urban blocks, but they can travel through their imagination, through artwork, through film, through fiction and things like that. So I think that's an interesting. I think to me that's the most interesting thing, is to look at how we have developed our thinking about nature over time.
So this class is on social issues. So you truly think that environment, because some people would argue, but the environment is a social issue.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. You can, like, this is what the academy does, right? We carve up these things and we study them sort of out of context, in whether it's accounting or or literature, right? But if we strive to, like I say, as a humanist, to understand, first of all, that there is a relationship here. There's another attitude thing is this. There's a Judeo-Christian tradition that this was all created by somebody, and then that some other guy gave names to everything and had dominion over everything. And it's not, there's different attitudes of how you're going to behave if that's what you believe, yes, versus people who believe they came out of the ground. And there's something about the relationship with animals and plants is like what we would consider relationships between people. And so there's such a variety of these things, and one isn't or shouldn't maybe be more dominant than the other. But so it's all about living, and the choices that we make and the impact that those choices have, not only on nature but on us, because we're part of it, right? Yes. We can't forget that we humans are not above nature. We are part of nature. We are human animals, and if we do something to the earth that is going to make it difficult for life to exist, that we're not exempt from that. Yeah. And there's some people who think that maybe we can. That's why Arthur C. Clarke or whatever, will go out to the stars and we'll just recolonize, or we'll just grow gills and live underwater, or but watching this stuff recently about these giant pieces of ice falling off in Antarctica, they're not going to stick back on, right? No. So what is the consequence going to be? We think of every year, every single year, there's either flooding that happens and damages, the reason we care about it is it damages people's homes or lives or something like that. But it happens all the time, or wildfires. There's parts of California that just burn every year. Why do we build there? And so there's all these issues, because that's part of our relationship. We have this sort of, like I said, this hubris about nature and how it's supposed to bend to our will. Yeah. And then it doesn't, and we get upset about that. Yeah. So, there ought to be a great example of how we're not ready to have that conversation, I guess, happened in the 19th century when, John Wesley Powell, who a Civil War veteran, he was an explorer he's the guy who finally filled in the map of North America by going down the Grand Canyon, on a boat. He was then in charge of the United States Geological Survey. So he sent out these teams throughout the West to fill in all the details. And in his report to Congress, he recommended, because of the particular, the vast spaces and the relatively limited water, he recommended that the United States does not settle parts of the West via territories and then states, but to think of watershed districts. Okay, and so you've got, as you know, or people who study history know, part of the Civil War was all about this kind of game they were playing about entering new states into the nation as either free or slave, and they had to balance out. So states were political chits. They were things that were done. So here's this guy coming out, saying, well, we shouldn't do that with parts of the West. We should rethink the way we are going to settle it and even organize its politics. And it just wasn't going to happen, And so we're going to draw a rectangle for Colorado, and we're just going to do that, and it's
we need to put, as Americans, we have to put everything in little boxes. That's what Western society does.
Yeah.
And so we have to have these little boxes of Colorado and Utah.
Sure, and this goes back to the Enlightenment and sort of thinkers and the impact on Americans like Thomas Jefferson and others. The rectilineal grid, from Ohio River west. If you ever fly, you look down, everything, all these little squares. That's this idea of, again, humans imposing, some sort of rational system on what is otherwise a different thing, which nature doesn't necessarily subscribe to that. Yeah. So a lot of problems come into that, whether it's boundary wars or whether it's just, that management. Because then think about all the things that are tied to county, city, state, nation, for funding, for environmental management. I talked about the 70s and all the environmental laws. That's the environmental decade, right? We have Earth Day. We have, the Nixon administration. Kind of, ironically, there's just an awful lot of clean water, clean air. All these acts are passed. Certainly, Johnson in the late 60s started some of that. But they're all tied to geopolitical entities, and sometimes the states follow the nation because they have to. Other times, we've got these people out in Nevada now who are these ranchers who are basically saying they don't have to follow any rules at all because we've always done it this way. And you have people debating about this idea of illegal immigrants and all this stuff, and the only people, you have Native Americans are the ones who can stand up and say, well, I think of you as illegal immigrants. So how far do we go? I mean, where do we write those stories about nature, and where do we start them? Where do we end them? And then that's kind of what's important.
Boy, I wish I would have taken one of your classes when I was at Ball State. By the way, he teaches at Ball State. I think I forgot that in the intro. So what do you think that people can do to help the environment?
Well, I don't know that everybody can or should strive to be, Rachel Carson or, those things happen when they happen for a variety of reasons. But what you can do, and what we all should do, just generally, is make it your business to be more aware. Again, because of the way our systems are set up, we've gone a long way very quickly from having a hand in where we produce our own food and dispose of our own waste and all that, to now where it's just this great mystery where, where does the food come from? Oh, the grocery store. Where does our waste go? Oh, down the toilet. Okay, or the sink. Well, what are you dumping in this? And you think about, simple things like recycling, to understand that process, that chain, of commodity, products that are then created out of these resources. And so I think that's the simple thing everybody should want to do anyway. It's an issue of homeland security. It's a national interest to know where your food is coming from.
Yeah.
So if you can't get into that, that bar is pretty low, I think, to have a vested interest, especially if you're responsible for other people, whether elderly or young, and you want them to have good stuff to eat and all that. But also when you think about where you live, whether you're renting, whether you're owning, whether you're visiting, you have an impact, and that time that you're in that space, the story is going to be different from that point on. So kind of know, at least in general terms, what its impact might be. And then maybe what the consequences might be, and are those consequences worth what you're getting out of whatever you're going to do? So whether it's you're living in a desert like Phoenix, should you really plant bluegrass front lawn out there and put in the irrigation system? Why? Well, I'm from Ohio, and that's what we do. Well, you're in Arizona now. Yeah. Maybe you should xeriscape and live like people live in Arizona before they were able technologically to transplant Ohio there, or something like that. Little things like that. Live locally, think about those things. It doesn't mean you have to go off the grid or become some eco-terrorist or something like that. But that would go a long way. And I think we see this becoming easier to do, whether it's with municipalities giving you the recycle bags or things being integrated into elementary school. Kids are thinking about this, and we're making this big shift from incandescent light bulbs now to these little tubes. It's a change, but is anybody going to really worry about that in a couple years?
No.
It's just the way light bulbs are now. So exactly. A lot of things are like that. Right now they might seem like you're asking me to, I'm not going to, and all that sort of thing. But if you think back to that bigger picture again, how we're part of something relatively fragile, and that's why the most iconic image in American history is probably that photograph from the moon of Earthrise, right? From the Apollo mission, where we kind of just got in one frame. We're on this thing. We're not just, our perspective here, and we can't see the forest for the trees, right? That gave us the view of, wow, what we do does matter, because this is all we've got. Yeah, so.
I thought you were going to say the Indian with the tear, the Native American with the tear.
Yeah.
I love that.
Only you, yeah. Well, that's that kind of thing of keep America beautiful.
Yeah.
They played on people's sympathies and all of that. That was a time of Indian activism. It was a time of very much romanticism of Black Elk Speaks and all that kind of stuff, New Age sort of things. So here you are putting up somebody who's unassailable in the relationship to nature. Remember the buffalo, they used every piece of it, all that kind of stuff. And to have him, have somebody throw some trash out of his car, land at his feet, and you get up, pan up and see that tear, that really struck home in a very romantic and maybe stereotypical way.
Yeah, they
the
had
ecological Indian is a stereotype. Indians messed up parts of the environment, sure.
Yeah.
But their impact was not as great as what we're able to do now.
Yes.
And so that's the distinction, is the techniques, the technology develops, and with it comes the reach and the impact that it leaves. And I think that's where we don't, we're thinking back with a pioneer cutting his own wood, lifestyle, but a coal-fired plant in every county across America has an adverse outcome that a little fireplace or something in a log cabin isn't going to. So,
well, I know that had they showed that the Native American on Saturday morning cartoons, and that's kind of where I got started thinking about the environment.
for sure.
So we did a quiz in our class, and where you take a quiz on your carbon footprint, and I thought I was going to do pretty well because I recycle, I watch my water use, I have a Prius, I try and do all these things, and I didn't do so well. I had a couple Earths. So so do you think there's hope for the planet?
Wow, I don't know. I would like to think there is, because I'd like to think that many more generations of humans and related to me will continue to enjoy it. But I think it's not too much to say that there is a time of reckoning that has to be. People have to look hard at these things and realize what is important. And we haven't been faced with that. We've lived in this long era of abundance, seeming abundance. As we've picked all the low-hanging fruit. We've done all the things we can, and still the grass will grow and things will flower. But we're getting to the point now, like Rachel Carson was telling us in the 60s, and there's stories all the time, that the impact is greater, and the half-life of some of this waste will far outlive human existence. And we're playing around with that, and so is that responsible? Is that sustainable? So I would like to think that if we ignore those warnings, I guess, I don't think the prognosis is really all that great. But if we start to at least become aware, have conversations, and then think about how we can adapt our lifestyle. I mean, survival's about adaptation. So that's pretty easy to get your mind around, I think. And so as far as organizing that and coordinating that, I mean, those are the age-old bugaboos of human civilization. That's why we fight. That's why war has always been there. So we're going to have struggles between those who want to do things and those who don't. And then those who have a vested interest in profiting off of the way things are versus how can they figure out how to profit off of what they will be. So, that's why alternative energies are lagging. It's not because they don't work. It's not because people don't think they're a good idea. It's because people have to figure out how to make a killing, a ton of money off of it. And so.
Okay, on that happy note,
Yeah, right.
we're going to wrap up here. I'd like to thank Doug for coming in and talking to us. It was wonderful and enlightening. I could go on for a long time. We will have a discussion board about this, so send us thoughts and questions and comments, and we'll have a conversation about it.
Yeah.
All right.
Stay curious, keep reading.
Yeah, there you go. All right, and thank you so much. I really appreciate it. And SuperMOOCers, we'll see you on the discussion boards.